Welcome to the 13th session in our Middle Eastern history series. Today, we're going to talk about a lot of different groups, not just the Seljuks and Khwarezmians, but also we're going to talk about Georgians um, and Kipchaks and all these different groups of people, because this is and Ismailis, because this is going to be a period with a lot of fractious dealings. This is the Game of Thrones episode of the Middle East. So the rules, if you're not familiar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not certified in history, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing. I'm just an amateur who really enjoys this, and I'm going to try and give it from a secular perspective, right? That I'm going to talk about what we know from historical records and what we know in terms of relationships between groups. As always, let's be respectful. But even though it's respectful, I do enjoy questions, comments, clarifications. Please do ask things as they come up, and add interesting information that you think could help or bring other people in. This will be a 101 and a 201. If you already know this period in time, I'm going to tell you a lot more. And if you didn't know anything, this will be sort of a basic way through. And of course, like all the other sessions that you can find on Omnicarta, which is Zach's website, this is going to be recorded, and so you can watch it later, or you can watch any of the other 12 episodes, including the one that Sergio gave as a guest lecture that can sort of prepare you for Sunday's gladiator presentation that he's going to do. All right. So everybody's favorite part, the quiz. All right, so let's see what you remember about the Crusades. And which of the following describes the similarities between the 5th and 7th Crusades? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
I see B. B looked correct.
I've got B from Howard and I've got C from Rama. And it's actually the case that Rama is correct here. It's C. The 5th and 7th Crusades were both invasions of Egypt. They both landed at the coastal port of Damietta. The 5th Crusade, it took them a little over a year to besiege the fortress and take it. The 7th Crusade, they took it within a week. And then they tried to advance further down the Nile Delta, where they were stopped at the castle of Mansoura. King Louis the Eighth did orchestrate 2 crusades, but those were the 7th and 8th Crusades, not the 5th and the 7th. The Venetians were not the majority in either crusade. The 5th Crusade was primarily made of people from the Holy Roman Empire, and the 7th Crusade was primarily made of French. And D is false because Frederick Hohenstaufen did not arrive in the 5th Crusade. He was supposed to, but he failed to do so. Which was a source of friction between him and the Pope, and he was not involved at all in the 7th Crusade. All right, question number 2. What was Sultan Al-Kamil's primary motivation in granting King Frederick II Hohenstaufen most of Jerusalem and other holy sites without bloodshed?
Like B.
Yeah, exactly. B is correct.
Yeah, D is interesting.
Yeah, no, D is interesting. It actually worked the other way around, is that a lot of Europeans tend to think that these more pliant Muslim leaders like Al-Kamil, like Al-Mustansir Muhammad in the Hafsid dynasty would convert to Christianity. Al-Kamil didn't really believe that Frederick II would convert to Islam. He didn't think the Kingdom of Jerusalem would attack the assassins. While he did have a lot of good relations with Frederick II and considered him to be a man of culture and letters, he didn't see fit to reward this with Jerusalem, but rather with a giraffe that he sent from the Kingdom of Kanem-Bornu that he had a relationship with. So it was really that Al-Kamil was worried about his brother, Muizz-ad-Din, and other Ayyubid emirs throughout the Levant region that could actually pose a threat to him.
They got a choice between a giraffe and Jerusalem.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Frederick II gave him a polar bear in response, so things are even. Question number 3. Which statement about the Mamluks who came to Egypt, which statements are accurate? Choose all the statements that apply.
A, B, and C all look good to me, not D and E.
I'm comfortable with D.
Howard, what about your fucking ball?
What? Oh.
No, don't ignore it.
Oh. Yeah, I definitely agree with B.
Yeah, so B is definitely one of the answers. We also have C being an issue that they had. They had issue getting legitimacy from the Abbasid caliphs, primarily because, we have C being a thing that they had difficulty getting legitimacy from the Abbasids. Remember, they were supplanting another legitimate Sunni dynasty, so the Abbasids did not want to recognize that, and they negotiated over the course of about 10 to 15 years, finally bringing the Abbasid Caliph from Baghdad to Cairo after Baghdad
Shut the fuck up,
was
Richard.
destroyed. And because of this,
Fuck the Mecca.
and so because of this, what ended up happening was that they established the caliphate in Cairo, and that caliphate in Cairo survived from 1258 all the way.
I don't give a fuck,
1517,
Richard.
when Selim I of the Ottoman Empire took it over. Now D is very interesting. The Mamluks actually didn't have a hereditary monarchical system. And the reason that they didn't have a hereditary monarchical system is that they ruled sort of as a council. And the leading Mamluk would take power, but then he would cede it to others if the situation arose. So the first 4 rulers of the Mamluk dynasty, right, Aybak, and the young boy, Qutuz, and Baybars, were all not related to each other. So we have this system, and we also have E, that we have these shrewd military victories like Anjalut, and it was through these and by working with the Byzantines and the Golden Horde that they were able to constrain Hulagu Khan and keep him from invading Egypt. To A is close to what happened, but Dur actually used the Mamluks to prevent Turan Shah from taking power and effectively gave power to Aybak by marrying him. He ended up executing her in 1259. His son ended up executing her in 1259 when Aybak was killed. All right, question number 4. Let's do that. Why was the 8th Crusade, despite failing to achieve any territory for the Crusaders, not seen as a complete failure?
A.
Yeah, that is actually the answer. Caliph Muhammad al-Mustansir of Hafsid, Tunisia, gave permission for Catholic monks to proselytize and renewed his vassalage to the Kingdom of Sicily. Those things led to the French and other people in Europe not seeing the Crusade as a faculty. Sorry, not as a failure. The other things are just false. Caliph al-Hakim I did not defect from Baybars. He remained in Cairo. The additional forces of Edward Longshanks were not able to cement the relationship with were not able to actually make a coherent alliance. They did work with Abaga Khan. And so the alliance didn't end up working out, although they did continue to send messengers. The speed of Crusader withdrawal effectively prevented. The Mamluks, one of the things that we're going to see about them when we get to the Ottoman period is that the Mamluks actually are very bad at managing the seas. They use does, which are sailing ships, but these are not advanced sailing ships. And so the kinds of ships the Europeans have were vastly superior over the water. While the Fatimids could compete with the Genoese and Venetians, as we start to move outside of the Fatimid period into the Ayyubid and Mamluk periods later, shipping technology does not advance in Egypt while it does advance in Europe. All right, and question number 5, which 3 of the following are accurate statements about Baibars?
Well, I think F is wrong.
Okay.
I think when he captured Acre, didn't he send somebody a nice letter describing all the stuff he did?
Acre only fell in 1291. Baibars actually died in 1277.
Oh,
So
okay. It was something he captured.
he captured a lot of things.
Yeah.
I do remember something about building roads and bridges.
Dig.
Yeah, that's right.
Dig.
Yeah, I also have from the chat somebody discussing B, which is true. Baibars was a devout Muslim, and he built numerous mosques and centers for the development of Sunni fiqh. And we talked about the bridges, and we talked about the fact that F is also correct, right? That Baibars was successful against the Crusaders, including his taking of Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, and Antioch in 1268. But as I said, he died in 1277, and Tripoli fell in 1289, and Acre fell in 1291.
Antioch must be where he wrote the letter. Okay.
Sorry?
Antioch must be where basically the lord of the place had gotten out. And so Baibars sent him a nice letter describing how he slaughtered everybody.
Yes. It's actually, yeah, one of the things that Baibars kept doing is that he kept attacking positions, and when the Crusaders surrendered, requesting that they have the ability to evacuate, he actually would end up betraying them and execute them on the spot once they opened up the citadels. So if somebody wrote a letter after leaving, it was probably in the later attacks by his successors Qalawun and Khalil ibn Qalawun. So that's why E is false. Khalil ibn Qalawun is the son of Qalawun, not Baibars. Baibars was not an indigenous Egyptian, right? We talked that he was a Mamluk, which means, and he was actually born in what's today Kazakhstan. And A is false because Baibars was uniformly opposed to the Crusaders. He didn't actually reach out to them for an alliance, except one time against the Mongols. And even in that case, the Crusader state of Jerusalem was the only one of the 3 remaining Crusader states that even entertained the possibility of an alliance, and they sort of pled neutrality. Antioch and Tripoli were allies of the Mongols, and suzerains. All right, so now we sort of look at some of the stuff that we can remember from our previous conversations, because we're shifting back to Iran, right? And we had mentioned that the Abbasid, the first you had the Rashidun Caliphate conquering Persia and subjugating it to the Arab centers of power. First in Damascus, right? That was the Umayyad Caliphate, and then to Baghdad, which was the Abbasid Caliphate. But even though the Abbasid Caliphate was Persianized, it took an increasing step for Persians to reclaim their own power, right? And so we saw that during the Iranian intermezzo. We saw this sort of reclamation of Persian power, the establishment of the previous nobility, those big Khan, and they were able to create several different empires throughout that period in the late 800s, early into the 1000s. And then we talked about how by basically the year 970, which is when this map is from, this is in the middle of the Iranian intermezzo period, the Abbasid Caliphate pretty much vanishes off the map in terms of a political sense, right? Abbasid Caliphate becomes an ecclesiastical caliphate. It doesn't really have much to do with the actual daily governance of these territories, but confers upon them legitimacy. So you can see here, the only states, obviously the Christian states are not being legitimized by the Abbasid Caliph, but of the states here, the Fatimid Caliphate, because it is a Shiite Ismaili state, and the Buyid Emirates, because they are a Zaydi Shiite state, are not getting legitimacy from the Abbasid Caliph, but all these other states that are Sunni states are getting that legitimacy. I mean, I have a question here about where we can find this map. I'll put a link in the meetup page where you can find this map. All right. So one of the things that we also noticed is that we started having these Turkic invasions from Central Asia, where they enter into Iran through what's called Khwarezm. This area called Khwarezm is the area just south of Lake Aral. Can you see my pen if I do this?
Yes.
Okay, so that area in the circle just south of the Aral Sea is Khwarezm, and the area just to the south of that is Khorasan, right? You can see that there. So the Central Asians would come from east of the Sirdarya River and enter Khwarezm. Then from Khwarezm, they would move to Khorasan and enter the central Iranian area. And among the first Turks to do this were the Ghaznavids, and the Ghaznavids created an empire at the northern edge of India and dominated Iran. They got legitimacy not because they were in long-term relations with the Abbasid Caliphate, but because they opposed the Buyids who had controlled the Abbasid Caliphate's terrestrial territory. And the Buyids were, as we mentioned, Zaydi Shiites. So because they were Sunnis, the Abbasid Caliphate was willing to recognize them over the Buyids. So this is a time period that, because the Ghaznavids, despite being violent nomadic Turks, did support the sciences and development that existed in the greater Iranic sphere, which is why you have Abu Rayhan Bayruni on the left-hand side. He was a philosopher primarily studying religious differences, and we have Ferdowsi, who was a writer who composed the Persian epic, the Shahnameh, which is the primary national epic of Iran today. And you can see Mahmud of Ghazni, who was the ruler of the Ghaznavid empire, receiving a coat from the caliph signifying his legitimacy as an imperial piece. Okay. So we also talked about that the Ghaznavids were then replaced by the Seljuks, and the Seljuks also came from the north. They came from an area much closer to Khwarezm, but they came in and they pushed out all of the other groups. They managed to push the Byzantine Empire all the way back to the edge of the Anatolian Peninsula. After the Battle of Manzikert, they expanded into the Caucasus region. And we talked about how it was a dynasty founded by a man named Seljuk Bey, and he was succeeded by his two sons, Tughril and Jagre. And these guys basically set up this empire. Now, we followed that up with specifically showing how they displaced the Ghaznavids, how they got the permission of the Caliph of Baghdad, because remember, Baghdad was still under Buyid control, but the Seljuks pushed them out. And then we have this era of Iqta feudalism, right? Where Nizam al-Mulk, who is a Persian from a very wealthy Deccan family, a Persian noble family, very well educated, he meets with Alp-Arslan, who is the son of Tughril Bey, and they decide to sort of split their authority, right? Alp-Arslan is going to handle the military details. And the thing is that a lot of nomadic groups are coming in from Central Asia under the Seljuk banner, different Turks speaking different languages. They're not part of this family, but to a certain extent, they can be used to lead the conquests of these territories. And the way that they decide to reward the Turks who fight is by giving them iqta, or divisions, these parcels of land. And the iqta system allowed these Turks to then derive rents from the land that they controlled in order, so that way they wouldn't pillage everything. They would be very similar to other quasi-settled, quasi-nomadic people who now lived on a certain piece of land. They wouldn't be farming it. They would still be horse riders and generally soldiers, but they would be able to derive rents from the land and therefore sustain themselves. But this system required an incredible bureaucracy in order to maintain. And so Nizam al-Mulk, who you can see on the left-hand side, right, he decided to develop a bureaucratic system for training and teaching the next generation of Persian bureaucrats who would manage the system over the entire empire. And this was called the Nizamiya, or systemic, right? Nizamiya means systemic in Persian. And so they built these systemic universities. You can see the main one was the Nizamiya University of Baghdad, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. So, but this is a building that's built in the same style as the Nizamiya of Baghdad would have been built. And these buildings trained people both in theological disciplines. Nizam al-Mulk was a Shafi'i Sunni, and so he taught, he had Shafi'i Islam and Shafi'i jurisprudence taught at these schools, but he also taught them the fundamentals of running this system, how to do the accounting, how to do the landowning. And Alparslan and his successors would maintain the role of organizing these Turkic groups to fight against the various territories that they wanted to add to the Seljuk Empire. Right. And so what we end up with is this massive empire governed from Isfahan. The one exception, of course, as you can see in the upper left-hand side, we talked about this, is that the Seljuks who went to Anatolia, which they called Rum, because to them that was the Roman Empire, they broke off in a separate Seljuk dynasty. But the other territories were at least nominally under the control of the Seljuk Sultan in Isfahan. And we mentioned that Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, right, is run by people like Kilij Arslan and people from his dynasty. They're able to control the area very close to Constantinople by the use of these Turkic light cavalry. And there were a number of them that had settled based on this Iqta system in Anatolia. So because of that, he was able to maintain his own quasi-independence from the Seljuk principalities to the east. And you can see that he was cut off from them by the Danishmends and Armenian Cilicia, which was a functional land border that was really useful for them. So now we're shifting to the eastern side, right? What was going on in the east, right? Again, you can see this map, all of the areas that are pink or red or brown or gray, those are all Seljuk principalities. They're called Arabeg. Arabeg meaning father prince in Turkish. And so those terms came to be used for these different territories that all had their own governing Turkic leadership that would be loyal to the Great Seljuk. But at the same time, because of the Iqta system, they had a large scale of power over these territories. Separate from this, we remember from times past that the Fatimid Caliphate, the Fatimid Caliph was the leader of the Ismaili Shiites, right? Those 7 are Shiites. And when Afdal Shahanshah took power as vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, he tried to choose Al-Musta'li to be the new caliph when Al-Mustansir Billah died, even though Al-Mustansir Billah had appointed Nizar, his older son, to be the caliph. And there was large support, especially outside of Egypt, among Ismailis for Nizar, which resulted in Nizar rebelling, but eventually being expelled from Egypt. And that resulted in the assassins that we talked about. So the assassin movement, if we remember, occurred not only in the area, in the Levant region where it would affect the Crusaders, but it also occurred in Iran. And in fact, we're going to see today that it's a huge fundamental part of what Iran goes through at this time period. So let's dig in. When Alparslan died, he was succeeded by his son, Malikşah. And Malikşah ruled for 20 years, from 1072 until 1092. Malikşah led numerous expansionary campaigns, pulling together these Turkic groups and invading in pretty much every direction. You can see that he invaded Khwarezm region, he invaded Khorasan further, he even invaded areas along the Saudi side of the Persian Gulf. He sent expeditions all the way to Yemen, and he sent expeditions to all the areas that would be taken later by the Crusaders. So one of the things that he starts doing is that he starts creating these iqta by bringing Turkic groups with him and telling them to conquer the region. So one region that we're going to see, Khwarezm, that was taken over by a man named Anushtagin Garchai. And Anushtagin Garchai, you can see in the top, he's the one in the green. He was a Turkic leader, and he was basically made Shihna, or regional governor of Khwarezm, as a part of his iqta. Because he conquered this territory, he was able to rule it now. And this was in accordance with Nizam al-Mulk's system of creating all these iqta that would be managed by the individual tribal groups. In terms of the bureaucratic function, Nizam al-Mulk also created a divan. You can see the Ottoman divan in the lower left-hand side, but it would have been much the same in this time period, where the different bureaucratic leaders from all the different areas, all these different dikkan across the Seljuk Empire, would come and debate policy and create uniform regulations across the empire. In terms of running the Middle East, one of the areas that became vitally important was what was called the Jazira, or the island, which is sort of an ironic name for it, but it's the land between the two rivers as you move further into Syria and northern Iraq. And that area, the Jazira, is very unique for the Middle East in that it is a grassland. There's enough water there for grass to grow, but not enough for you to have forests like you do in some parts of Iran. So because of this is the ideal place for Turks to congregate, because they can pasture their horses here before they attack other areas of the territory. And as you can see, despite its location being very close to what would eventually become the Crusader states, this area was vitally defended. You can even see the picture. There's a picture from Al-Hasaka in Syria, which is toward the western side of this Jazira. And you can see that the area is incredibly grassy, which is why it was so desirable. This system created a functional aristocracy, right? Because on the one side, you have all these foreign Turks who are involved in military campaigns and extracting the wealth from the new territories they conquer. And on the other side, you have all these historically Persian nobles, right? People who have been historically nobles in Persia, right? Because this is all coming from the Deccan class who are running all these matters of state. And accordingly, the local people begin to feel that they are not being treated well. So this is where we have the Ismaili revolution in Persia. So starting in the 1070s, you start to have a lot of what was called Dawa, or Islamic evangelism, going on in the Seljuk Empire. And this Dawa is being run by Ismailis that originally are receiving their orders from Egypt, but slowly but surely are beginning to divorce themselves from that. And the biggest split, of course, happens in 1094, when you have that split between Nizar, the older son, and Al-Musta'li, the younger son. The Fatimids choose to go with the younger son. The Persian Ismailis go with the older son. But even prior to this point, the Persian Ismailis start to reach out to the wider Persian community, right? Because under this system, you start to have immense taxes and a degree of instability that the average Persian is facing. You can sort of imagine what these Persian farmers look like on the lower left-hand side. Some things really haven't changed if you go to very rural areas of Iran. And the Ismailis preached to them that all people are equal before God. And it really became a religion of the people. One of the most common things that the Ismailis would do is that they would refer to anybody who had converted to Ismailism from Sunni Islam as a rafiq, or a comrade. So they began to create this sort of quasi-socialist atmosphere, if we can use that word anachronistically. And many people converted to Ismailism openly, but also there were a number of bureaucrats who converted to Ismailism secretly. And part of that secret was how the leader of this movement, Hassan al-Sabah, you can see him in the upper left-hand side, was able to effectively gain some of the most strategic castles that he was able to gain. Of course, his most famous one, and the first one that he got his hands on in 1090, was the fortress at Alamut. You can see the sort of a stylized drawing of the Mongol invasion of that fortress, but that wouldn't happen for over 200 years at this, no, over 100 years, and so years at this point. So in 1090, what he was able to do was convert a guard who was running the castle, and basically the guard let him in. And because of that, he was able to take this castle and its incredible strategic position. He also began to take numerous other castles throughout the region. As somebody notes in the comments, Alamut has been completely razed. Most of these castles don't exist except for small bits and pieces. But all in this area, just south of Gilan, along the Alamut River, they ended up taking over a number of these fortresses high up in the Alborz Mountains, which made it nearly impossible to uproot them. Now, for the most part, they were willing. It's also very forested up there. Now, for the most part, they were willing to deal with the Seljuks, even though their long-term goal was to expel the Seljuks and create an Ismaili state, a Persian state. In fact, they were so interested in pushing this Persianness that they were the first group that I'm aware of that started using Persian as a liturgical language, not just a literary language, right? Because even those Iranian intermezzo regimes that used Persian as a language of administration, like the Samanids or the Safavids, they never used Persian as a liturgical language. They still prayed in Arabic. Arabic was still the language of theology. But because this revolution posed a direct threat both to the Sunnism and to the Iqta structure that Nizam al-Mulk had created, Nizam al-Mulk decided that he had to destroy this revolution. And so he launched numerous attacks on the fortresses. Now, as we've discussed, these fortresses are incredibly remote and difficult to access. And the Ismaili movement was very popular in the areas that they had control. So ultimately, these missions did not manage to destroy the castles that the Persian Ismailis were ruling from. And in return, they decided to begin their tactic of assassination, right? Because these are the Ismailis who become the assassins as well, right? This is just the Persian side of that story. We saw the Crusader side of that story. This is the Persian side of that story. And their first target for assassination is Nizam al-Mulk himself, right? And he dies in 1092. His death, followed in a few months by Malikshah's death, really puts the empire into chaos. Because Malikshah never chose who would be his successor. So you end up having this war of Seljuk succession that starts in 1092. Now, if we remember from our Crusades, this is right around the time that you're having Pope Urban II reading his edicts and starting to create that groundswell in Europe. It's exactly the time when the Seljuk state is the weakest. And it really comes to a contest between two half-brothers, both sons of Malikshah, but by different mothers. So on the left, we have Berkyaruq, and on the right, we have Muhammad I Tapar. These two rulers were both trying to control all of the Seljuk territory. but neither of them could really expand their control west of the Jazeera, right? This island between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So now both of these groups tried to defeat the other one before trying to expand their influence west, which is why most of the groups along the Levantine area were individualistic city-states, as we saw. So one particular example of one of these sort of quasi-independent Seljuk groups was led by a man named Ilghazi. And Ilghazi fought all along the Levant region. He was the son of Artuk, which made him an Artukid. He conquered Jerusalem. He fought the Crusaders at the Battle of Air Sanguinis, which was incredibly bloody for the Crusaders. But after that, he was asked by Berkyaruq to come to Baghdad and then assist him in fighting Muhammad Tapar further east. In Baghdad, Ilghazi, like most of the Turks, was reviled. They thought that the Turks were barbaric. They hated the fact that they relied on these Turks. They thought that in truth, the Caliph should have his own military force made of Arabs or Mamluk, something that could be tamed, and these kinds of groups were undesirable. Now, as long as Ilghazi was fighting for Berkyaruq, Berkyaruq had an advantage. But with Ilghazi retreating back to the Jazeera, because in Baghdad they didn't like him, the tide began to go closer to Muhammad Tapar's direction. So in order to make the difference, Berkyaruq began a mass conscription of the Persian peasantry and asked the assassins, the Ismaili order, to fight alongside with him, which of course allowed Tapar to disgrace him as somebody who was willing to adulterate the faith. Regardless, as long as Berkyaruq was alive, he died in 1105. As long as he was alive, he was able to control Baghdad and the western part of the eastern part of the empire. When he died in 1105, Muhammad Tapar seized Baghdad and declared himself the Great Seljuk. One of the things really to remember here is that in order to maintain control, both of these sultans had to keep dividing their domains and giving land subdivisions to different tribal leaders of different Turkic groups in order to maintain their military coalitions, because otherwise leaders would desert one ruler and go to the other. For example, we're going to learn about Ahmad Sanjar, who is a full brother to Muhammad I Tapar. And Ahmad Sanjar was originally with Berkyaruq, but switched to Muhammad I Tapar when Tapar promised him territories. So these alliances were very, very loose in the sense of it wasn't entirely reliable that you would have one of these Turkic groups fighting beside you unless they had a stable iqta, they had one of these stable subdivisions of land. All right, how are we doing? Okay. So just to remind us of where we are, right? Because we just sort of zoom past the year 1100. During this time, this is when the Crusaders are having all their successes, right? This war of succession between Berkyaruq and Muhammad I Tapar meant that they couldn't send any forces to deal with the situation going on in the Levant region until 1105, when Berkyaruq was dead. So that's why when you saw the Atabeg of Mosul, Kirboga, and he sent troops, he was fighting on his own, that was not with the permission of, that was with the acceptance of the Great Seljuk, but it wasn't his sending them. Kirboga was moving on his own merit. And that was actually the reason why, if we remember, Kirboga had sought the alliances of Radwan of Aleppo and Dukak of Damascus, and they had formed a unit of troops together to fight the Crusaders at Antioch. But as soon as they got to Antioch, Radwan and Dukak withdrew in order to allow Kirboga to lose, because they didn't want Kirboga to become stronger than either of them were, right? So the divisions on the western coast of the empire couldn't be patched over by the Great Seljuk, because the Great Seljuk's attentions were further east, right? And so we saw Bohemond of Taranto scaling the walls of Antioch to bring that city under Crusader control. We saw Baldwin entering Edessa because the Armenians invited him. We saw the Seljuks actually lose Jerusalem in 1097 to the Fatimids, and then the Fatimids lose it in succession to the Crusaders. All of these things because they could not expend the effort to really fight that war when they had to put all of their soldiers in this civil war conflict. Now, we mentioned that in 1105, Berkyaruq died, and so Muhammad I Tapar became the Great Seljuk without ambiguity. And so he became slightly interested in what was going on in the Crusader states, and he sent the Atabeg of Mosul after Kerbogha died. This was a new Atabeg named Maudud, and he sent Maudud to fight against the Crusaders, and he was able to unify a much larger force. He also allied with Tukhtakin in Damascus. He was the successor to Dukak. Now, this would have ordinarily been a great Seljuk success, and the Seljuks would have been able to, if they put their full weight behind it, roll up the Crusaders at this point. However, the assassins stab Maudud because they see that the growth of Seljuk power is injurious to their ability to continue to run their Ismaili state. So with the assassination of Maudud, there's nobody in the Great Seljuk Empire who's willing to lead the coalition anymore, this coalition going to the Mediterranean coast. And so it goes back to the localized battles between these Atabeg in the region next to the Crusader states and the Crusaders themselves. So during this same point, as there's a civil war in the Seljuk Empire and Muhammad is consolidating his power, we begin to see a new player in the region. Now, Georgia is not a new kingdom per se, right? We know that Iberia and Colchis, the two proto-Georgian states, existed at the time of ancient Greece, right? That's the story of Jason and the Argonauts. They go all the way to what is now Georgia. But Georgia as a political player in Middle Eastern politics, this is something that's more new. And so this really begins during the Georgian Golden Age, which is started by King David VI, called David the Builder. And he's called this because he liked to build things, which should not be that surprising. His major accomplishments in terms of construction were two major accomplishments. The first one is the Gelati Monastery in Kutaisi. Kutaisi had been the capital city of Georgia and had been for several centuries, especially because Tbilisi had fallen under Arab domination as early as the Abbassid Caliphate and had not come back under Georgian domination for a quite significant amount of time. It was ruled by the Emirate of Tbilisi. And so Kutaisi was the Georgian capital city, and so George the Builder built this monastery in Kutaisi to anchor the Orthodox Church. His goal was to promote orthodoxy and, like the Crusaders, be a source of Christianity in the East. The second building that he was responsible for that was really special was the Academy of Ikalto, which he built in Tel Aviv, which is further east in the empire, and was built in that area that says Kakhetian Heretian in the German map. So it's closer to that area, and he built it, of course, after he conquered it in 1104. This academy, in addition to teaching theology and other religious matters, also taught math and, to a limited degree, other humanities and sciences in order to prepare the next level of educated administrators in Georgia. The Academy of Ikalto became a center of religious and quasi-secular education in Georgia over the next century or so. What King David IV, though, is really known for is having expanded the empire. Now you can see all of those territories. The dark blue territory of Georgia, that was what he inherited when he came to power. But taking Erzurum, the area around Erzurum, taking the area around Ani, all of modern Armenia and most of modern Azerbaijan, and almost all of modern-day Georgia. Taking all those territories was his great military achievement. And the real reason he was able to do this was his very smart military tactics in the Battle of Didgori, which took place in 1121. So Didgori is very close to Tbilisi and is on the side of a mountain. In order to win this war, King David IV got together a coalition of Georgians and Kipchaks, right? We've talked about Kipchaks before. They're the nomadic people who come from the area directly north of the Caucasus Mountains. You can even see on the map, it says Reich der Kipchaken, which is Kipchak in German, right? So that's the Kipchak territory. And so he got about 15,000 Kipchak horse warriors, and he brought about 40,000 Georgians to this area, Didgori. He sent the Kipchaks ahead of the Georgians, and the Seljuks, who were there, led by Eldiguzids, the one we met before, saw these Kipchaks as fellow Turkic soldiers, and so they didn't see them necessarily as an enemy. The Kipchaks took this to their advantage and killed almost all of Eldiguzids' leadership among the Turkic soldiers, and the Georgians finished it by attacking from all sides, coming out of hidden areas in the mountains, because it's a forested mountain. It was hard to see. But the Georgians effectively routed Eldiguzids' forces, and he was wounded in action. He died basically within a year. So because of this, Tbilisi and almost all of these areas began to fall immediately quickly. The Seljuks had such a porous northern border because of this loss at Didgori that King David VI approved of a number of raiding missions by Georgia against the Seljuks in what's now Iran and Eastern Turkey. One of the points that maybe I should make is that Georgians are Eastern Orthodox Christian. Of course, we know that the divide has happened between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism in 1054, and he chose the Orthodox side. That didn't make him any less willing to work with Crusaders or Frankish knights, and he had a number of Frankish knights in his military, and some of them did even fight in the Battle of Didgori. I have a comment. Okay. So at this same time that the Georgians are making progress in the north, we've talked about how the Persians have started a small revolt of their own, the Ismaili state, to try and push the Turks out, or at least give them more control in the matters of state, even though they can't muster a large military force. We see the same thing from the Abbasids. So starting with Caliph al-Mustarshid, they begin to press the Seljuks for more independence, more autonomy, and Caliph al-Mustarshid ends up in a military confrontation with the Seljuks. He's taken prisoner, but while he's a prisoner, he's assassinated. It's unclear whether he was assassinated by the Ismailis, who of course hated him as a Sunni caliph, or he was assassinated by the Seljuks themselves, who didn't like his independence streak. But it didn't matter. This further galvanized the feeling in Baghdad that the caliphate should be independent. And so the next caliph who succeeded al-Mustarshid, Rashid Billah also tried to fight for independence. And he was expelled from Baghdad by the Seljuks. He fled to Isfahan, where he thought he would receive the protection of the great Seljuk at the time, Ahmad Sanjar. but he was there assassinated by the Ismailis. And this one we know for certain because the Ismailis celebrated for 4 days. And you can see this is in modern Isfahan. This is the tomb for Caliph Rashid Billah because he was buried where he died. But independence for the Abbasids really only came after the siege of Baghdad in 1157. So after al-Mustarshid, after Rashid Billah, there was another caliph, al-Muqtafi, and he defended Baghdad against the Seljuks, and he withstood a siege that went for over a month. However, in 1157, there were a number of other issues facing the great Seljuk Empire, especially the death of Ahmad Sanjar, which threw a lot of the power into chaos, and dynastic struggles began. So that that army was much more important to be allocated to fighting other Seljuks than it was to besieging Baghdad. So this siege of Baghdad was lifted, and al-Muqtafi was given a degree of independence over actual terrestrial authority. Now, his authority was primarily the area around Baghdad, but under successive caliphs, they began to push closer and closer to the sea. And by the time you get to the year 1200, they control all the area that you can see in the upper right-hand side map. All that dark green area becomes under direct Abbasid terrestrial control with Seljuk suzerainty. So we've talked about what happened in the northwest, right, with Georgia. We talked about what happened in the southwest with the Crusaders and the Abbasids. Now we're going to talk about what happened in the northeast. So, as I mentioned, Ahmad Sanjar was a vassal of Muhammad I Tapar, and he was appointed as the Sultan of Khorasan. And so you can see a picture of him on the right hand, on the lower left-hand side, but the right-hand side of the two men. Ahmad Sanjar here is on the picture of the 5-Manat note from Turkmenistan, and he was appointed as the Sultan of Khorasan, charged with keeping that upper northern area of Iran protected. At the same time, Berkyaruq appointed the son of Anushtagin Kharchai, Qutbuddin Muhammad, as the Khwarezm Shah. So it was an upgrade in title that the son was now a king in his own right of the area of Khwarezm. So the two of them were charged with holding back this Karakhanid Khanate. And eventually, in the middle of the 1100s, the Karakhanids became vassals of, in the early 1100s, they became vassals of these two men. And so the Karakhanids built a number of outstanding buildings in what's now Uzbekistan. You can see the area in the orange circle is southern Uzbekistan. The area in the sort of the red circle-ish triangle is the borders of modern-day China, right? So you can sort of see we're in the middle of Central Asia. And in the upper right-hand side, you can see one of the few really great surviving monuments built by the Karakhanids during their vassalage period to the Great Seljuk. And it's actually the tower in the center, the Poi Kalan. It was originally part of a large complex, but the Mongols destroyed almost all of the complex. The tower, though, they kept. And you can see on the right, this is the tomb of Sultan Satuk Bukhara Khan. Sultan Satuk Bukhara Khan was the first Karakhanid who converted from Buddhism to Islam, right? And changed the empire from being a Buddhist empire to a Muslim empire. So by the time that they were interacting with the great Seljuk Empire in this latter stage, they were already Muslims. They were all Sunni Muslims, one in a state of vassalage to another. Now, one of the interesting things, and we're going to see it again, especially when we talk about the Mongols, is that nothing occurs in a vacuum here. So a massive change is occurring in China at this same time, right? 1111 is the middle of the reign of Muhammad I Tapar, right? The Seljuk Civil War has just ended, and these relationships with the Karakhanids that I just discussed have really just been set out. So everything is going to change when the Jurchen people from Manchuria invade northern China, right? Northern China at this time is controlled by a nomadic people called the Khitai. The Khitai is actually where the Russian word for China, Khitai, comes from. So these Khitai were running a dynasty in China, and they had run it for a few hundred years, I think a little over 100 years, and that was called the Liao dynasty, right? Khitai is the ethnicity, Liao is the name of the dynasty. So these Jurchens attacked the Liao dynasty and pushed them out of northern China with the help of the Song, or the South China dynasty. And the Jurchens set up their own Jin dynasty, right? Jin is the name of the dynasty, Jurchen is the name of the ethnicity. So both the Jurchens and the Khitai are non-Han people, right? The Jurchens are what are called Tungusic people. The Tungusic people are the indigenous people of the easternmost part of Siberia. We're talking about the Far East region with Vladivostok, all the way up to Sakha region. Those people are all Tungusic. The Khitai are Mongolic, but they're not Mongols in the sense that we think of them. They're Mongolic, Mongolic in Turkey. So they get pushed out by the Jin, and they flee further west, and they're called, and these ones that flee further west are called the Karakhitai, or the Black Khitai, right? And once they're that far west, they're going to start interacting with the Middle Eastern world, right? So the Karakhitai set up their empire on the western edge of what's now China, and also parts of what's now Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, the eastern part of Kazakhstan. So that's where they are, and you can see them on the map in that sort of orangish color, right? The Karakhitai, the Western Liao Empire, and they're ruled by an emperor, right? Because it's the Liao Empire. They had been Chinese emperors for over 100 years, so they kept the title emperor, but they became more popularly known by their Turkic names. So you can see on the upper right-hand side, that's sort of a modern representation of Yelu-Dashe. Yelu-Dashe was the emperor of the Western Liao, and he wanted to expand his influence further west into territories that had become vassals of the Seljuk Sultan, right? You can see on the map, you have the Seljuk Sultanate in that sort of light purple. You have Khwarezm, which we talked about. Khwarezm is a vassal state under the Khwarezm Shah. And the Khwarezm Shah is loyal to the Seljuk Sultanate, so that's a vassal. You also have the Western Karakhanids, right? We talked about how the Karakhanids are also a vassal of the Seljuks at this point. So you have these three vassals, these two vassals of the Seljuk Sultanate against the Karakhitai. And the Karakhitai, because of that pressure from their eastern flank, are trying to move further westward and take what they can. So we end up having a battle between these parties in 1141 called the Battle of Katvan. Now, the Battle of Katvan is the first time that Ahmad Sanjar is put in a conflict that he should have won, but he didn't win. Ahmad Sanjar has been fighting ever since he took over as Great Seljuk from Muhammad I Tapar in 1118. So he's been in power for over 2 decades at this point. And he's fought a number of different pretenders to the throne all across the Seljuk Empire. There are some in Iraq, there are some in Turkey, there's some in the eastern areas of Turkey, there's some in what's now Syria, there's some in northern Iran, all over. And Ahmad Sanjar has to keep putting down all these rebellions by these different Turks who have their iqta and they want to expand their power. It should have been relatively easy for him to defeat the Western Liao. He had superior firepower, he knew the terrain, it was in Seljuk territory, and his vassals were there, including Atsiz ibn Muhammad, who was the Khwarezm Shah at the time. And while he and Atsiz had numerous problems in the past, it's very clear that Atsiz was fighting on the side of Ahmad Sanjar. Now, the picture of Ahmad Sanjar here is from a Turkish soap opera that recently came out, which is why he looks slightly more handsome than he did in the Turkish Turkmenistan Manat note. So the two of them brought their forces to bear, but Yelu-Dashe was able to convince the Karluks, who were another nomadic faction that had joined with the Seljuks, to desert and switch sides. And this led to Yaludasha substantially defeating Ahmad Sanjar at this Battle of Katvan. It meant that the Khitai now had an open entrance into the easternmost flank of the Seljuk Sultanate. And it couldn't have happened really at a worse time, because the Karakhitai were really able to expand their power at the cost of the Great Seljuk. The only other major battle that Ahmad Sanjar lost, and unfortunately this loss, similar to the loss of Katvan, was more injurious than all of the victories had managed to stave off, was that there was a rabble of Turks that he had to put down in 1153. These were Oghuz Turks, just like the Seljuks were, and these Turks were able to defeat him in 1153 and imprisoned him until 1156. And during that time, because he was imprisoned, he wasn't able to coordinate all of the defenses of the empire. And these Turks moved throughout the empire, pillaging and burning as they went. Between 1153 and 1156, they destroyed a number of major cities in the empire, or burned significant portions of them. There were numerous Nizamiya academies. You remember that Nizam al-Mulk had built these Nizamiya academies that they torched because they had no respect for the Persian aristocracy. They also killed numerous civilians, and it created a deep sense of anger among the popular citizenry that the Turks were not able to protect them from these roving hordes. Right, because the thing is that the Turks had basically legitimated their claim to power on the fact that they were able to maintain military power and allow the Persians to provide the internal economic, social, and political organization. But if they couldn't actually maintain the military structure, then there was nothing worth defending. And so when Ahmad Sanjar died in 1157, the empire really fell apart. Now, despite all of this, right, Ahmad Sanjar ruled from 1118 to 1157 as the Great Seljuk. And before then, he was ruling for over 20 years as the Sultan of Khorasan. So he was in power for nearly 60 years. So he was in power for nearly 60 years. And during the time that he was in power, there were a lot of key poetic and literary developments that were going on in Iran. On the right-hand side, you can see two poets. You have Anvari, who's represented by his picture, and Nizami Aruzi, who's represented by his most famous book, Chehar Makale, which is Persian for four dialogues or four discourses. It's a set of poems that is about the Persian aristocracy and sort of major philosophical questions that people are dealing with, and it's written in an epic poem form. You then have his tomb was constructed in Mer, which was one of the largest cities of Khorasan, which was the area that he had been the Sultan of. The tomb did not survive, but it was rebuilt in the last 20 years according to the historical way that it would have been constructed, which is why you can see everything around it looks very short, and then it looks pristine. But that was the tomb of Ahmad Sanjar in the location that it was. You can see the picture of Ahmad Sanjar from Jami' at-Tawarikh, which is a Persian text on the history of the Persian kings. This is a text that was written during the Timurid period, but almost all the pictures that we've seen, for example, of Berkyaruq or Muhammad Tapar, they've come from this piece of writing. And because of the amount of writing that we have from the time that Ahmad Sanjar was in power, we know a lot about what the day-to-day life was in Iran during this period. A perfect example is that this is an incense burner that was used by the Seljuk Sultan of Iraq. And so incense would be put in the animal's mouth, and it would make the room smell nicer, right? We have all these details about this time period in which the Persian aristocracy did relatively well. The peasants were were somewhat overburdened, and the Seljuk Turks were themselves competing over the territory of their own empire. With the death of Ahmad Sanjar, we really have a situation where this is what the Middle East looks like. And you can see that it's a dizzying amount of different states all vying for power. If we simplify it a little bit, it looks like this, right? And even still, this is a lot of different states, but there are a couple things that we can tease out here immediately. Georgia is huge, right? We've never seen a Georgia this big, and we're going to see why in a few minutes. Khwarezm has taken over the area of Khorasan as well, right? It's really expanded from the north towards the south and taken over parts of what's now northeastern Iran, Afghanistan, and consolidated its hold there. We also see that the Karakhanids are gone, and they've been replaced with the Karakhitai, right? This Western Liao dynasty from China. And finally, we see that the most powerful of the central Turkic groups is the Eldiguzids. And the Eldiguzids were a Turkic group based in what's now northwestern Iran, right? The territory of Iranian Azerbaijan. So we're going to learn a little bit more about these Eldiguzids. They fought numerous battles with the Georgians. Most of these battles did not go as well for the Eldiguzids. For example, this is in the center upper part, you can see the gate of Ganja. Ganja is a city at the edge of the Eldigusid kingdom in the north. It's in modern Azerbaijan, Republic of Azerbaijan today. And the city had numerous gates at the edge of the city. The Georgians took these gates back with them to Kutaisi, to the monastery in Georgia. But the Eldiguzids did win a number of other military engagements defending their territory, especially those that they had to fight against rival Seljuk groups. Similarly to what we talked about with the Ahmad Sanjar, there was a lot of poetry being written at this time in the territories controlled by the Eldiguzids as well. This is Nuzhat al-Majalis, and Nuzhat al-Majalis is a compendium of 300 different poets writing over 1,400 different poems that span all different types of lifestyle, issue, ritual, that expresses how people were feeling in the empire and what their values were and what they were interested in. We don't have a lot of architecture that survives from this time period because of the Mongols, but we do have some things that survive. In particular, this is from Nakhchivan in Azerbaijan today, and this is Momine Khatun Mausoleum. Momine Khatun was the wife. Khatun is generally used for women. So Momine Khatun was the wife of Shamsuddin Eldiguzids, who was the founder of the Shamsuddin Eldiguzids was the founder of the empire, but this was his daughter-in-law, Momine Khatun, and so his successor actually built that for her as a memorial to her person. The point that I wanted to really raise with the Eldiguzids is, in addition to controlling all of this area, these Turks respected all of the social and political capital of the Persianate culture. And you see that in all of these different small emirates. Another thing to point out is that the Eldiguzids were able to start to command the the suzerainty of other territories. For example, the Seljuks often paid them tribute, as did the Karakhanids. Okay. So now we're going to talk about Queen Tamar of Georgia. This is the second and bigger Georgian Golden Age. She has the title Mepeat, Mepe, which in Georgian means King of Kings. And as Georgia had been in the Persian cultural sphere for millennia at this point, they had taken that Shahan Shah title, King of Kings, and translated it into Georgian, but they even applied it to her. They did not, there are writings in Georgian that refer to her as a queen, but generally speaking, she had the title King of Kings, and she was respected as an equal, even though there were certain military duties that had to be given to a king consort. Regardless, she was seen as the ruler of Georgia during her very long and auspicious reign. On the right-hand side, you can see a modern Hungarian painting where Shota Rustaveli, who is the Georgian Shakespeare, is presenting his epic poem, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, to Queen Tamar. The Knight in the Panther's Skin is a tale of chivalry where two men go out in seek of this jewel, the jewel being an allegory for the queen herself. And it was very well received when he wrote it. It has since become the quintessential Georgian epic poem. She was also responsible for expanding the empire. You can see the Georgian Empire bigger than you've ever seen Georgia, and nearly every country surrounding Georgia is either a vassal state of Georgia or a dependency of Georgia, which means that it's an independent state that doesn't necessarily pay tribute but has strong fraternal relations. There are frescoes of her throughout the kingdom. This is a particularly famous one. There's the city of Vardzia in southwestern Georgia, and that city is actually built into the cliffside. And so this is from the Church of Dormition, which is inside of a cliff, and you can see Queen Tamar made. Now, one of the interesting things is that the coins that you see are actually the same coin. One is the front side, one is the back side. And on the left side, you can see in Georgian writing that it talks about Queen Tamar. And on the Arabic side, you can also see that it's talking about Queen Tamar. Queen Tamar recognized that a lot of the territories that she controlled had significant Muslim populations that were either Arabic speaking or Persian speaking, and so expected Arabic to be on the coins. And so she did that. She accommodated the fact that not everybody would learn Georgian or could speak Georgian. In terms of the Georgian influence that she exerted, a lot of that came through her second husband, King Consort David Soslan. Her first husband, Yuri, was a Russian noble, and Yuri could not be tamed, could not fall into line with the queen, and so she forced the nobles to grant her a divorce from him, and she married David Soslan, who was much more willing to accept an empowered woman leader in Georgia. He commanded the military forces, and they invaded the territory controlled by the Eldiguzids, as well as northern areas of Khorasan. So you can see on the right-hand side those invasions. In those invasions, the Georgians sacked several cities, including Ardabil, which was one of the Eldiguzid capitals, and they brought that wealth back to Georgia. At the same time, the Georgians were negotiating for more power in the Holy Land. Georgian kings had already built the Monastery of the Cross, which is in Jerusalem. It's actually very close to the Israeli Knesset today. And at that time, it was a Georgian monastery. At this point, Saladin had recently taken back Jerusalem, right? Remember, Saladin took it back in 1187. We're now in the late 1180s, 1190s, into the 1200s. So Saladin had taken back the city, but Queen Tamar was able to send a delegation to Saladin that permitted the Georgian monks to stay. She also bid on the Holy Cross because Saladin, as we remember, confiscated the Holy Cross at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. She bid on the price. She actually was willing to pay more than the Byzantine emperor, but she did not get the Holy Cross. Of course, after the Battle of Hattin, as we've discussed, the Holy Cross disappears from the historical record. At this same time in 1204, if we remember from the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople loses control the Byzantines lose control of Constantinople to the Crusader states. So Queen Tamar of Georgia sees this as a perfect time to create a much more favorable Byzantine state on her borders. Now, if we go back a little bit, you can see that that area called Trebizond was part of the Byzantine Empire, and it bordered with her region of Meskheti. And so she decided to splice it off, and the way that she did that was to invite the Komnenoi, the royal family of the Byzantine Empire, to come to Trebizond, because the Komnenoi were not given power in any of the fractional states that resulted from the carving of the Byzantine Empire. So she met with Alexios Megas Komnenos, and she basically invested him with the title of the new emperor of Trebizond. Because since Constantinople was no longer under Orthodox control, the Byzantine Empire couldn't contest his title. So he became the emperor of Trebizond, and he ruled from that city, which is modern Trabzon in Turkey. Of course, when the Byzantine Empire was reconstituted in 1261, the title changed a little bit to accommodate the fact that the Byzantine Empire was recreated under the Paleologian dynasty. But Trebizond always remained in close relationship with Georgia throughout the next 200 or so years until it fell to Mehmed II the Conqueror.
Richard, I'm sorry, here in the Georgia, are they still Islamic religion, right?
No, Georgians are Christian. They're Orthodox Christian.
Queen Tamar.
Queen Tamar was Christian.
So Georgia is always Christian, never been Islamic.
If we go back a little bit, you can see the areas of the reign of King George, right? And so we have this sort of dark blue area. That dark blue area was the historic area of Georgia, and that area almost always was Christian. There were Muslim minorities that existed there, but generally speaking, up until this point, had almost exclusively been Christian. If you look further east, you see where it says Imarat Tiflis and it says Kakhetian Heretian. These areas tended to have more Muslims because they had been under Muslim control for a longer period of time. But in Georgia, there's a very strong national connection between the Georgian nation and the Georgian church. Very similar to the Armenian connection to the Armenian church, similar to the Coptic connection to the church in Egypt, right? So you have this sort of national consciousness that exists around the church. And so when Tbilisi was liberated and the majority of people there were Muslim, those Muslims were typically not considered Georgians.
So
of course, yeah.
So their religion is close to the Constantine,
Yes.
the Orthodox, but they are not belong or under the Constantinople's
Right. So
control.
it's
Kind of like a Protestant, to the Roman Catholic, something like this.
Something like that. But I think the easier way to understand it is that Catholicism has a pope on top, and below the pope you have all these cardinals, right? And the cardinals represent certain territorial areas of the earth, right? One cardinal might come from northeastern United States. One cardinal might come from a certain area of Africa, right? These cardinals represent certain territorial regions, and they all funnel up to the top of the pope, who unifies the Catholic Church. Imagine for a second that you didn't have that unifying pope, and you had all these cardinals that existed in different countries and were running Orthodox churches that all recognized each other as legitimate, but were all running each other separately, right? So that's the way the Orthodox Church works. So the Byzantine emperor was responsible for the Orthodox Church in his territory. The Georgian king was responsible for the Orthodox Church in his territory. The Russian Tsar was responsible for the Orthodox Church in his territory. And so the churches were different.
So in the sense, they have the stronger concept of the state than the Western Europe.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So that sort of brings us into what Georgia has been doing. And Georgia, of course, is an ascendant power at this time. It's unfortunate, of course, for the Georgians that Queen Tamar dies in the year 1213. But of course, if she had lived a decade longer, she probably wouldn't have been able to do much against what was coming her way anyway. So we talked about now what happened in the west between the Eldiguzids and the Georgians. Now we can talk a little bit about the east. So while there was all that fractional infighting after the death of Ahmad Sanjar, the Khwarezm Shah was able to take advantage of this moment, right? And we remember that the Khwarezm Shah on this map is that purple area, right? It's this incredibly large state that's based in the region south of the Aral Sea in Central Asia, the modern countries of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, right? So it controls that area. And they were able to use this fractional infighting between the Seljuks to expand. And so you had two Khwarezm Shahs, Arslan II and Tekish, who ruled between 1156 and 1200. The two of them basically cover a 45-year time period. And you can see their mausoleums. It's pretty much the only structures of theirs that survive. Both of them in Urgench, Turkmenistan. And these two men were able to push the borders of their territories further and further south and west. Now, after Ahmad Sanjar died in 1157, that didn't stop the coronation of great Seljuks, and we still had ones that followed. This in particular is the last great Seljuk, Tolkul III, but each of these great Seljuks had less and less power. So even though the Khwarezm Shah was technically a vassal to the great Seljuk, it was the Khwarezm Shah who had the real power in the empire and was able to compel the great Seljuk to listen to him. Finally, in 1194, Tekish was tired of even feigning loyalty to the great Seljuk and removed him from power. Now, one of the things that's sort of interesting is the way that the Khwarezm Shahs built their military, right? Because their military really shows the combination of different groups that were fighting in the empire. So in the upper left, you had the Piadigan, and the Piadigan were Persian foot soldiers. These were generally individuals from lower classes. They were given any tools that they could use to fight, be they swords or axes, and it wasn't terribly standardized. On the upper right-hand side, you had the Ghulaman, and the Ghulaman is similar to the Mamluk that we've talked about before. These are enslaved soldiers that were taken from Central Asia. They're typically horse riders, and they use bows and light armor. And the Ghulman, their ability is that they move very quickly, and they have exclusive loyalty to their owner, right? Because as slaves, they have masters. On the lower left-hand side, we have the Aswaran, or Asparan, or Savaran. There are different names for it. And this is the Persian equivalent of the cataphract from the Roman side. In fact, I believe the Persians invented first. Somebody might correct me on that. And it existed as early as the Sasanian period. Now, in order to be a knight like this, with heavy armor and protection and this specific look, and especially the protection for the horse, which was extremely expensive, you had to be from the noble classes. So these were wealthy Persians connected to the Nizamiya system that Nizam al-Mulk had set up. And so this was another contingent of the Iranic society. And finally, on the lower right-hand side, we have the Khwarezmian lancers. There were lancers and also swordsmen. And these were, unlike the Ghulaman, these were free men. And they typically came from either the Kipchak tribe that we've seen before, or they were from the Kangli tribe. Kangli tribe was one of many groups that were pushed out by the Karakhitai from their historic homeland. And so they came into the Khwarezmian territory and pledged that they would serve if they could live under the protection of the Khwarezm Shah. So you now had all these four very different groups fighting together, right? The Persian poor, the enslaved Central Asians, the Persian wealthy, and the free Central Asians. And together they created a very strong and scary force to bear down on the great Seljuks. They were, as you can see on the map on the right-hand side, Sultan Tekish really expanded from the areas that are dark to the areas that are light. So those areas in what's today Iran, Azerbaijan, southern Afghanistan, and even the areas to the north in what's now Kazakhstan, where he was fighting the Karakhitai, those were expansions under Sultan Tekish, under Shah Tekish. Now Tekish aligned himself with a Caliph, Nasr ad-Din Allah, and the Caliph was willing to grant him authority if he would remove the Great Seljuk, and so he did that. But the two of them got into a personality conflict, when Shah Tekish sent his vizier to the Caliph killed him because he was annoyed, and this resulted in a mini war between Shah Tekish and the Caliph. It didn't expand to anything beyond repudiations and the Caliph not allowing pilgrimages into Abbasid-controlled territory, because at the end of the day, the Caliph didn't have a strong military. But it meant that a lot of the legitimacy that the Khwarezm Shahs needed was legitimacy that they couldn't get. Combine that with the fact that all these Kipchaks and Karakhanids Turks that had come into the empire, because of the Khwarezmians, were not terribly popular with the local population. They started demanding iqtas of their own, and they started repressing local citizenry. It didn't help that the Kipchaks, in particular, were brought in by Tekish's wife, Terkin Khatun, because Terkin Khatun was herself Kipchak. So as soon as Tekish died in the year 1200, there were revolts all throughout the Khwarezmian empire, and the successor to him, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, spent an incredible amount of time trying to put them down. So, in addition to trying to put down all these internal revolts that were taking place in the year 1200, he also had to put down an external revolt. So you can see Ghiyath ad-Din Muhammad on the right-hand side. He was Sultan of the Ghurid Sultanate, which was a Turkic sultanate controlling the northern part of India. He invaded with his brother Muezzin, and the two of them invaded all the way to Gurgan, which is on the Caspian Sea. You can see on the map their pathway into the empire in the year 1200. Ala-ad-Din Muhammad had to defeat the Ghurids and expel them from the empire, and then later he launched invasions of his own. In 1211, he attacked that southern portion of Pakistan called Makran. And in 1215, he attacked their capital directly and sacked it, which meant that the Ghurid Sultanate was in a state of disrepair and disunity for quite a while. He also had to enforce his claims against the Georgians and the Eldiguzids and bring them under his direct authority, which he did in around 1208. And he had to fight the Karakhitai to secure the area in what is now Kazakhstan, where you see that black arrow. In fact, he even took Samarkand, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan. And you can see some of the Karakhitai architecture that was there from the Shahizinda Memorial Complex. Some of that was built as early as this time period. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that you have these Turkic Khwarezm Shahs replacing these Turkic Seljuks in the majority of Iran, to the great consternation of the Persian people. They didn't like the Seljuks that much. They could tolerate them, but they didn't like them that much. The Khwarezmians they really didn't like, because they engaged so many battlefronts all the time. We're not able to preserve long-term unity. And we're just on a very simple level, economically abusive. So this is sort of where I want to leave everything. This is the map in the year 1200, just before the storm, right? So you can see the Jin and Song dynasties in China. You have that Karakhitai, right, that Western Liao Empire that's just at the border with the Khwarezmians. You have the Ghurids pushed back out of what's now Pakistan and into what's now India. You have the Khwarezmians controlling almost all of the eastern part of the Great Seljuk Empire. You have the Ayyubids. That should not be Ayyubid Sultanates. That should be the Mamluks. No, sorry, it is Ayyubids. Yeah, you have the Ayyubids controlling the Egypt and much of the Levant. You have a few small Crusader states hanging on, and you have other Turkic groups and the Georgians. And we're going to see how almost all of these groups end up suffering mightily when the Mongol horde shows up. So, any questions, curiosities?
No, this was great, man. Very, very nice presentation. What's interesting is, back in the former Soviet Union, they were writing about Yuri as being the Tamar's first husband, is being drunkard.
He was.
And he was beating up on her, basically. And all the nobles, some nobles sided with him, and he went to Constantinople, came back, and he wanted to take over the reign, and even took some of the Kakheti region himself with some of the Georgian nobles, and then he was defeated by Tamar.
Yeah.
And
No, absolutely. No. Once Yuri was expelled, there were 2 different attempts that he led with nobles who wanted to unseat her. There was definitely a degree in the noble court, a number of people in the noble court who didn't believe that she had the wherewithal to rule. But thankfully, the majority won out, and one of the most successful rulers in Georgia's history, if not the most successful, was able to do what you could do.
Right. And then there's another thing that was interesting. There's this Tibetan soldier scrolls that were found around that same time when Tibet was, that stretched out, obviously. They were on the border of almost of Khwarezmian border, and the soldier writes about the outpost of the Tibetan kingdom and what went down. He got into, Karakhitai took over. He got imprisoned by Karakhitai, and he got imprisoned by Khwarezmians, and he writes pretty clearly what each of them represent and how. So the whole thing was just interesting. If anybody get a hand on that, it's called Tibetan Soldier Scrolls from around that time, below 1200s.
No, it's one of the things that people sort of forget is that the Middle East actually borders on Central Asia, and so does China. So there's a lot of cultural go-between in Central Asia, especially when you have things like the Silk Road, that results in these people being in areas that we don't think of them in. Yeah.
It's the paradigm. It looks like everything is so divided, even more so than now. And obviously, whatever was coming, the storm was coming. That they were almost asking for it, because nobody wanted to fight against that storm.
Yeah.
So, Richard, I'm interested in on the south part. Okay, that the Dali. Underneath the Dali, there's a pagan. Is
Pagan,
that the
yeah.
right name? That's the name, pagan?
It's Pagan. It's a Burmese kingdom.
Oh, Padan. Okay. Pagan. Pagan. Okay. Is that a Tibet or?
No. Pagan is Burmese.
Oh, that's Burmese. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, all those states around there, Assam, Arakan, Pegu, Pagan, all those states are Burmese states.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. You know,
Mhm.
it's great. You know, I see the Chinese history, but from the outside. Okay, from the west side. Okay.
No, were you here when we talked about the Jurchens and the Liao?
Yeah, the Diao and then Jin and the New Chen, and I all familiar with this history, but
Right.
I hear from you from outside, not from inside. That's very interesting. You know?
Yeah, no, it's interesting for us in in the Middle East that we sort of think that China is this sort of thing that doesn't really connect to us with the exception of the Mongols, and it's not the case at all.
No, like
lot-
Karakhanids, right? Karakhanids, yeah. Actually, it's very important, but in the Chinese history, kind of like, you know, okay, it's gone, you know, but actually they are not gone. They become a big empire on the west side, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And so then it was the Persians and the other nomads in that area, like the Kipchaks, who had to deal with them.
Yeah, and it's interesting to the point of in Russia, they're pretty much the same thing. I mean, they told us we had Bosphorian kingdoms and like ancient times. They didn't say it was Greek kingdom. They were just Skiffs lived there, here and there, but we weren't taught sufficiently enough of a history to to speak on this intelligent level. Obviously, I had to find out from coming to other countries, and it's weird. And I totally agree with Jason that in former communist states, it was, unless it was like, for example, Stalin absolutely loved Spartacus because he represented this peasantry revolt that will support his communist ideas of an international international, So unless it was supporting communist ideas, they would not be, So we didn't know.
Yeah.
I was right next to Karakhitai. I didn't know about Karakhitai until I came to the United States. That's crazy.
Yeah, actually, it's a little bit crazy. You know, during this time, the Song Dynasty, actually, it's like the land in China is totally international, right? You look at this map, right? That's the international map. But Chinese teachers try to give people an idea, it's a united kingdom, right? Actually, it's not. It's like very international, and the song just represent one of the kingdom, right? So
Right.
It's
Like,
different, totally different view,
In China, there was a huge influence by Sogdianians who ran away from Muslims that came in 800, 700. Sogdian was a huge, Samarkand was under their rule, and they escaped. All the nobility escaped to China. And one of the generals, I don't remember his name is Liao. I don't remember his name is, but he was Sogdianian general that's actually ruled in one of the dynasties, and he was very famous. In fact, when they brought terracotta soldiers to Metropolitan Museum, there was horses from Sogdiana that were, they were called obviously heavenly horses, that were exported by China in those days. And that's how they basically brought them, to China. From the area where I live to, Uzbekistan, current Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all that area. So it's interesting. It's the world was more interconnected than we think,
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything to add, guys? Or by the
Just,
way,
just to thank Richard. Great presentation as always.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, slightly overwhelming, but very good.
No,
I think it's very overwhelming. Very overwhelming. I hope you can be
That's awesome.
a little bit slowed down.
But I think that's testimony to our lack of background, that most of us,
no, it's
with our
not.
history, we've just never run into this stuff.
No,
Yeah, that's true. Though.
It's not. In the Middle East, we don't even study. We generally don't study this period because people just sort of. I'm trying to find the right way. It's like the European Dark Ages. Like like if you ask people like what was going on in France in like the year 1200, like their eyes just glaze over. Like nobody knows. Nobody like. And so I was trying to. It was funny to try and find resources like to figure out like what actually happened in this time period. was much harder than a lot of the other time periods where it's like, did you see this amazing conqueror? This is the story of Saladin. This is the story of, you know, and like you have like 50 billion people talking about it. No, this was like trying to figure out who was where and what maps existed and what maps I had to draw myself. And yeah, no, this was a lot harder than they usually are, and it's because it's so confusing and so desperate in terms of nobody's happy. Just nobody's happy.
I believe we're happy.
No. I mean, I guess the poets were happy because there was a lot of poetry being written at this time. But
He actually is very important to, particularly in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan area. I mean, they recite his poems like there's no tomorrow. There's a museum of Nizami, Tashkent, and
no, you're talking about Nizami Ganjavi.
no, Nizami as well.
Sorry, you mean Nizami Aruzi or Nizami Ganjavi?
Nizami, yeah, his poems, Nizami poems. Even Michael won't lie to you. In the former Soviet Union, he was considered to be like a guy, you know.
Yeah. That's right. I don't remember his last name.
Right, no, because my intuition is that it's Nizami Ganjavi. He was from Ganja in Azerbaijan as opposed to Nizami Aruzi, who was from what's today Iran. So
yeah, the Iranian, Persian one, not the Azeri one. By the way, the Azerbaijan people.
But Azeri was part of Persia.
Right, no, when he wrote poetry in Persian.
His poetry is also in Persian. But I think you were talking about Rudek. He was among the first Persian poets after the invasion of the Arabs. And Rudek is very famous in Tajikistan, yeah, because Tajiks are Farsi speaking also.
Yeah.
So Rudek is very famous in Tajikistan.
Correct. He's also quite famous as well. What's interesting, the Azerbaijani was called, weren't they called the Caucasus Albanians at the time? Or that's how?
They were not. The Caucasian Albanians was a term that was used. That term had fallen out of use by 300 years ago, relative to where we are, right? Around 800 CE. Especially when you have the Turkic invasions at the beginning of the 1000s. Whatever Turkic-Iranic mix happened, they began to call themselves either Persians or Tatars or Turks or something else. But the term Caucasian Albanian was sort of retired after that point. They did still have the Caucasian Albanian Church, but they didn't call themselves ethnically Caucasian Albanians.
So they were Christian at the time, and then
they were Christian before the Turkish conquest, and then a lot of them converted to Islam. There was still a Christian minority, and that Christian minority still, you could say it exists. There's about 1,000 Udis. That's the ethno-religious group that they call themselves. They're called Udis. Who exist, and there's about 1,000 of them. Also, because of the small size of the Caucasian Albanian Church, it became part of the Armenian Church. It became subordinated to it in many respects. So it's possible that a number of Armenians who come from the territory of what's now Azerbaijan were Caucasian Albanians who, because of the ethno-religious Armenian identity, have become Armenians.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, Queen Tamar. I mean, that was the golden age of Georgia. It's crazy.
Yeah.
They still have. I mean, Shota Rustaveli. I mean, we have all the streets in all the Russian republics named Shota Rustaveli.
Yeah.
Richard, just to clarify that a bit. So, the Armenians are a separate branch of Christianity from the Orthodox.
Correct.
So the Georgians were Orthodox, but were sort of neighbors to the Armenian Christians?
That's exactly right. So Georgian Orthodoxy is within the Eastern Orthodox world. So Greek Orthodox, what would become Slavic Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Georgian Orthodox, these were all Eastern Orthodoxies. Then you have those Christianities that did not follow the 7 ecumenical councils, right? The Oriental Orthodoxies, like Coptic Christianity, Ethiopian, Assyrian. Armenian Christianity was one of those Oriental Orthodoxies.
Yeah, they were kicked out of the Rome-Constantinople axis.
Correct.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any history in Georgia of large-scale forcible conversions between Christians, and that's as far as I can tell. Armenians at this point in time were mostly in what's now Turkey. So it wasn't like they had a large Armenian population that they were dealing with. The area that they controlled included what's modern day Armenia, and there were certainly Armenians there, especially in the mountainous highlands that we call Nagorno-Karabakh today. But the Armenians were not the largest minority in Georgia. The largest minority in Georgia were Turks.
And it's interesting also, currently Abkhazia is a breakaway republic from Georgia, but they say at some point Abkhazia and Kakheti Georgians were one people, and then one converted to Christianity and one converted to, Islam, Abkhazians, and therefore they're separate. They went their separate ways, like with Bosnian, Bosniaks and Serbians in the same type of thing.
Sure. The thing is, though, that there are Muslim Georgians. Like, for example, Ajara region in the southwest of Georgia today is a majority. Well, maybe it's not majority, but it's like 40-60, if anything, Muslim. And in fact, in modern Georgian history, there are a number of Muslim martyrs who fought on behalf of Georgia. It just happens that at this time period, Georgian identity is very much tied up with the church. And to the extent that people like Batumi is in Ajara region, to the extent that there were Georgians who converted to Islam during this period, they recognized how central the Georgian church is to Georgian identity. It's very similar to how the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, the Druze in Israel recognize to a certain degree the Jewish nature of the state of Israel and their sort of role in that. So it's kind of that thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting also, I mean, knowing from my history, Georgian Jews do not follow the same wave of of Judaism, and they have very big distinction. They don't have Cohen Levi like we do, and it's interesting. What caused that? I mean, was they there?
I mean, I don't know. In terms of Georgian Jewish history, we actually don't know that much. We know a bit, but we don't know that much because there wasn't really a lot of discrimination against Jews in Georgia. They were pretty much accepted as Georgians, despite the fact that they were not connected with the church. Because the distinguishing factor in Georgia really was always, could you speak Georgian? That was sort of the marker. And so the Jews of Georgia did speak Georgian, whereas, for example, the Turks did not. And so they were considered something else.
Right. Or the Gorsky Jews spoke Tat, which is
Persian.
Right. So it's interesting.
But the Gorsky Jews were dealing with the government of the Shirvan Shahs, and then the governments of what's now Azerbaijan for the most part of their history. And those governments were ones that either spoke a Persian language or they spoke Turkic, or a combination, like we saw in the Seljuk Sultanate.
I believe Gorsky Jews have a lot of languages in their use.
Yeah, no,
the whole group have their own language.
Right, their language is called either Judeo-Tat or Juhuro, which is a dialect of Persian. That's their religious language, but of course they have Hebrew because of the liturgical stuff. They have Turkish, Azerbaijani Turkish because they live in Azerbaijan. They have to deal with Azerbaijanis. They have Russian because they were part of the Russian Empire. So they have all these languages, but the language of the Gorsky Evrei, of the mountain Jews, is typically considered Juhuro or Judeo-Tat, which is a dialect of Persian.
Yeah, we understand them really well from Hungarian Jews because the same Farsi dialect. It's like almost identical. Yeah, it's interesting. Wow, thank you, Rich. This was really incredible. Rama was asking next week we're doing Mongols, right? Just wanted to
yeah. Next week, it'll be a lot more straightforward, a lot more depth, but a lot more straightforward. Because we're just going to follow basically a gigantic wrecking ball as it moves across the continent. We're going to see the Khwarezmians try and resist. One of the things that a point that I wanted to make a little bit was that we mentioned when we were talking about last week we were talking about the Khwarezmians who were involved in the Crusades, and that between the 6th and 7th Crusades, that the Khwarezmians sacked Jerusalem in 1244. It was these Persian soldiers who'd been kicked out of basically all of their territory, sought some protection in the Ayyubid territories, and then once they were there, they were the most powerful thing among any of the Ayyubid sultans. So it should really give you an idea how powerful the Mongols were, that they steamrolled this powerful empire that even their remnants were more powerful than anything west of them.
Oh, one last question. Is Jalal al-Din related to the guy you just mentioned, another al-Din that came from?
Yeah. This Alaa ad-Din is Jalal ad-Din's father.
Oh, okay.
So Jalal ad-Din comes to power in the middle of this invasion. So he's called Jalal ad-Din Mingborno, and of course we're going to talk about him because he tries to recreate the Khwarezmian Empire while it's literally falling apart.
Yeah, he was quite a character, I'll tell you that much. He reminds me of the Carthage and Rome. You know, the Carthage is in Italy trying to conquer Rome, and Rome is in Africa trying to conquer the Zama.
Yeah, exactly. So he does this, like, he tries to conquer Georgia, he tries to conquer the Levant region, he tries to conquer India, and then he finally comes around back to Khorasan, which is of course what he was trying to get the first time around. Yeah.
I just want to welcome Mel. You know, do come back. See, we're pretty interactive here, and Richard did an incredible job. And see you either this Sunday. By the way, Saturday got moved because Paul had an issue with his computer and it was hacked. And I apologize. Today we also had a hack attack a little bit. We got hacked and we were able to mitigate it pretty quickly, not like last time. So sorry for that, and hopefully it would never happen again.
No, I mean, like,
It will, but you got to be on top of it.
Yeah, that's what I did. I killed them right away, reported them, all the measures I could take, I took.
Now you mentioned that there were 2 accounts. Were both accounts hacker attacks?
No, one account. So what they did is they hacked us about a month and a half ago when me and Rolf S were doing presentation on first war of Roman versus Carthage, and so he copied the picture of one of our members, and he called it something else because I didn't give him my ability to rename themselves.
当然，我那钉的弄好了啊。OK， 你可以去吃的。
Oh, that's Jason. Okay.
Jason, yeah.
And then so they came in with that picture, so I thought it was one of our people, and then he came in with another name too that I also thought that was one of our members, and right away I realized that he copied the picture of both of them. So
Okay.
I got rid of them. You know, initially I didn't know that. I thought they were our members, but they can't rename them now, so that's why they can't mask it. I reported them, so those accounts will never come in here again.
Okay.
Yeah, apologies.
No,
All right,
not your fault. You dealt with it promptly.
Yeah.
we dealt with it promptly, but you know, he was able to get his venom a little bit, but you know,
Well,
hopefully, you know, hopefully it will never happen again.
well, if you want the site to be open, you have to you're gonna catch shit like that.
Yeah, and I'll edit it out of the video.
Well, I mean, you really can't because it was in the middle of my question and answer section. But I think the amount, the speed that you got to it, there were like 2 or 3 interruptions where he's like, nobody cares about that, and that was it. So
I'm telling you, like, you just sit at home and have nothing else to do. It's like, oh, I'm gonna.
well, no, the thing is that if you react to it like some of the other presenters have, of like, no, you're taking over my presentation, stop doing that, like that just feeds the fuel if you actually just don't respond to them. Like I think that's why he didn't do anything more serious, like start blowing an air horn or something.
Start dancing naked in the picture. I actually was one of the presentation of my buddy, and he had 300 people on, and the guy just started dancing naked, and it was just horrible. You know, it wasn't a, let's just say, a fit guy.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things. The people who demonstrate their bodies are exactly the people who should not be demonstrating their bodies.
All right, I wanna thank you, Richard, again. Incredible job. Please rewatch this. I'm gonna post it tonight. This is worth watching at least a couple of times before the next quiz. All right.
Yeah.
Talk to you. Have a nice evening. Thank you, Richard, again. And
Hey, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.